Oh God, ma'am, I'm so sorry.
Who let her in? Did she win a raffle?
Hello, Nightingale.
She had soup on her dress. Not a stain, a streak, bright orange running from her collarbone down to her hip, because the waiter had stumbled and the whole bowl had gone with him, and 300 people in the most expensive ballroom in Junction City had turned to watch a black woman in a department store gown stand there dripping. Someone laughed first, a short, sharp bark near the bar. Then it spread the way fire spreads through dry grass, table to table, until even the string quartet faltered on their notes because the laughter had gotten louder than the music. Wendy Price did not move. She did not wipe the soup away. She stood very still in the center of that gold and crystal room and let them laugh. And the strangest thing was the small, calm smile on her face, like a woman watching children do something foolish. And at the far end of the room, a man in a black suit set down his glass. He had not laughed. He was crossing the floor now, and people were stepping out of his way without knowing why, and the laughter was already starting to die in the throats of those who saw his face. He stopped in front of her. The whole room was watching. And then he said her real name, the one almost no one alive still knew, and the silence that fell was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. But to understand why a man like that knew that name, and why the most powerful person in 3 states would cross a ballroom for a woman in a ruined dress, we have to go back. Not far, just 1 week, to the morning the invitation arrived. Wendy Price almost threw it in the trash. It came in a heavy cream envelope, the kind with wax seal, and she assumed it was a mistake or a scam, because women like her did not get invited to the Halverson Charity Gala. She ran a small bakery on Grant Avenue. She was 53 years old. She had a bad knee and a good heart and a savings account that made her wince. She slid it open, standing over the sink. The card inside requested the honor of her presence. It used her full name, Wendy Eloise Price, and in the corner, handwritten, in ink so black it looked wet, were 4 words: "It is time, Wendy." She felt her stomach drop through the floor, because nobody wrote her name like that anymore. Nobody knew to put that little curl on the W. There was only one person who had ever written her name that way, and that person was supposed to be 3,000 miles and 20 years away. She set the card down very carefully, like it might go off. Then she did something she had not done in a long time. She locked the bakery door in the middle of the day, sat down on a flour sack in the back, and tried to remember how to breathe. Her daughter found her there an hour later. "Mama, the door's locked. What's wrong? Are you sick?" Wendy looked up. "I'm fine, baby, just tired." But she was not fine, and her daughter knew it, because in 30 years she had never once seen her mother lock that door before sunset. What Wendy did not say, what she could not say, was that the past she had buried so carefully had just knocked on her front door, wearing wax and ink, and it had asked her to dinner. 200 miles away, in a glass office above a city that did what he told it to, Jung Cook was looking at a photograph. It was old, creased, a woman much younger, standing on a porch with a baby on her hip and the sun behind her. He had carried it through 3 countries and 2 wars that the newspapers never called wars. His assistant knocked. "Sir, the arrangements for the gala are confirmed. The Price woman received her invitation this morning." "Good," he said, and he did not look up from the photo. His assistant hesitated in the doorway because in 15 years of service he had never seen this man sentimental about anything. "Sir, if I may, who is she?" Jung-kook turned the photograph face down on the desk. "She is the only person," he said quietly, "who ever saw me when I was nothing, and she fed me anyway." The assistant did not understand. He had been told this woman was a baker in a small Kansas town with no money and no connections and no idea what was coming for her. He had assumed she was a target. He was about to learn she was something far more dangerous than that. She was a debt, and in Jung-kook's world, debts were the only thing more binding than blood. What no one in that glass office knew, not even the man who just ordered the gala, was that Wendy Price remembered him too. She just remembered him by a different name, a name from before he became the man the whole city feared. And she had spent 20 years praying she would never see that face again.
Let me tell you something about running away. You think distance does it. You think if you put enough miles and enough years between yourself and the thing you ran from, it stops being real. Wendy thought that too. She thought it for 20 years. She had built a whole life on top of the burial. A husband, now passed, God rest him, a daughter, a bakery that smelled like cinnamon every morning at 4. She taught Sunday school. She knew everyone's order before they ordered it. Nobody in Junction City knew that once, a long time ago, in a city much louder than this one, Wendy Price had been somebody else entirely. That night after the invitation, she went up to the attic. She had not opened that box in years. It was at the back, behind the Christmas things, under a quilt her mother made. She wiped the dust off the top and just sat with her hands on the lid for a while. Then she opened it. Inside was a different woman's life, a nursing badge from a county hospital, newspaper clippings she'd folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a dish towel, a small silver chain with a single charm shaped like a sparrow. She held the sparrow up to the light. "Run when you have to," a voice in her memory said, a young man's voice, half-starved, fierce, but sparrows always come home. Her hands were shaking now, because she suddenly understood exactly who had sent that invitation and exactly why, and the understanding sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. The boy she had saved had grown up, and he had not forgotten. It was 22 years ago, and it was raining, the kind of rain that feels personal. Wendy was 29 then, a night shift nurse walking home through a part of the city you didn't walk through if you had a choice, and she didn't have a choice because her car had died and her paycheck was 4 days away. That was when she saw him. A young man, maybe 19, folded into a doorway like a discarded coat, foreign, soaked through, and bleeding badly from a wound under his ribs that he was pressing with both hands, while his face went the gray color she knew too well from the hospital. Any sane person would have kept walking. This was not a safe neighborhood, and a bleeding stranger meant trouble had been there recently and might come back. Wendy knew that. Every instinct she had told her to keep her head down and go home. She stopped instead. "You're going to die in this doorway," she told him plainly, crouching down. "Is that the plan?" He looked up at her with eyes that had already given up. "Leave," he managed. "They'll come back, for me." "Let them come," she said, and she pulled his hands away to see the wound. What she did next was illegal and reckless, and the kind of thing that could have ended her career and her life. She took a stranger, a clearly dangerous stranger, home.
She stitched him on her own kitchen table with a sewing needle and a bottle of liquor and as steady hands the hospital had trained. He drifted in and out for 3 days, and on the third night, when his fever broke, he watched her ladle soup into a chipped bowl, and he asked her in a voice gone soft with disbelief, "Why? Why would you do this for me? You don't know me." Wendy handed him the bowl. "Because somebody once should have done it for me," she said, and didn't. He never forgot that sentence. He carried it through 22 years, through everything he became, and the man he became was a thing the world had reason to fear. But what neither of them knew that rainy night, what neither of them could have known, was that the people hunting that boy were still out there, and one of them was about to walk into Wendy's life again, at the gala, in a tuxedo, smiling.
The morning of the gala, Wendy almost didn't go. She stood in her bedroom holding the only formal dress she owned, a blue thing from a wedding 8 years back, and she thought about every reason to stay home. Her knee, her nerves, the past she'd worked so hard to keep buried. Then she thought about the sparrow charm and the 4 words in wet black ink. "It is time, Wendy." Whatever this was, it had found her. Running again wouldn't work. It hadn't worked the first time, not really. The past had simply waited, patient as winter, for her to think she was safe. So she put on the blue dress. Her daughter drove her, fussing the whole way. "Mama, who are these people? How do you know somebody throwing a $1,000 plate gala? You sell muffins." "I knew somebody a long time ago," Wendy said, watching the lights of the city slide by. "Before you were born, before any of this." Her daughter glanced over. "And that's all I get?" "That's all you get, baby, for now." What Wendy didn't tell her daughter, couldn't tell her, was that her hands hadn't stopped shaking since the invitation came, that she'd packed the sparrow charm into her clutch like a talisman, that somewhere in that ballroom tonight was a man who owed her his life, and she was terrified, because in her experience, the powerful did not like to owe. They liked to settle. And she had no idea, walking up those marble steps in her borrowed shoes, whether she was walking towards a thank you or a reckoning.
You already know what happened when she got there. The waiter, the soup, the laughter that rolled across that room like a wave and broke over her head. But I left something out. I left out what was happening in Wendy's mind while 300 wealthy strangers laughed at her. She was not embarrassed. That surprised even her. She stood there with orange soup running down the blue dress, and somewhere underneath the shock, a cold and steady calm rose up in her, because she had survived so much worse than laughter. She had buried a husband. She had stitched a dying boy on her kitchen table. She had been poor and scared and alone, and laughter, she realized, was nothing. Laughter was for people who had never been truly afraid. So she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who knew something the room did not. A polished woman near the bar, the kind whose whole face was an investment, leaned to her companion and said, loud enough to carry, "Who let her in? Did she win a raffle?" The laughter swelled again. And that was the exact moment a glass clinked down onto a marble table at the far end of the room, sharp as a gunshot in the laughter, and a man stood up. The people near him stopped laughing first, then the people near them. The silence moved outward from him like ripples, and nobody could have told you why, only that the temperature in the room had dropped and something important was about to happen. He started walking toward the woman in the ruined dress, and Wendy Price looked up across all those staring faces and finally saw him clearly. The boy from the doorway, grown into something else entirely. Her lips parted. But before she could say a word, before he could reach her, a hand closed around her elbow from behind, and a smooth voice murmured in her ear, "Mrs. Price, isn't it? We need to talk, now, before he gets here." She turned, and the face she saw made the blood leave her body.
She knew him. Older now, silver at the temples, expensive everywhere. But she knew that face because it had been in her nightmares for 22 years. It was one of the men who had come hunting the boy that rainy night, one of the ones she had hidden a wounded teenager from, one of the ones who, if they had found her kitchen, would have killed them both without a second thought. "You," she breathed. He smiled, all teeth, and tightened his grip on her arm. "So you do remember. Good. That saves time." Across the room, Jungkook had stopped walking. He had seen the man at Wendy's elbow, and something in his face, something that had been almost gentle a moment ago, went flat and cold and terrible. The silver-haired man leaned close to Wendy and spoke fast and low. "Listen to me carefully. That man coming toward us is going to ask you to confirm something tonight. A name, an old name. If you give it to him, you sign a lot of death warrants, including, possibly, your daughter's. She's outside in the car, the little blue sedan." Wendy's whole body went cold. "How do you know about my daughter?" "I know everything about you, Mrs. Price. I've known where you were for 11 years. The only reason you've slept safe in that little town is that you were not worth the trouble." He smiled again. "But you've become worth the trouble. Tonight you stop being a baker and start being a witness, and we both know what happens to witnesses." He thought he had her. He thought fear would make her small, the way it makes most people small. He had built a long career on exactly that. He did not know who he was talking to, because Wendy Price had stopped being afraid of dying a long time ago, on a different rainy night, with a needle in her hand and a stranger's blood on her kitchen table. And the thing about a woman who has already made peace with the worst is that you cannot threaten her with it. She looked down at the hand on her arm. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time all night, her smile was real. "You should let go of me," she said quietly, "because in about 10 seconds, you're going to wish you'd run."
Jungkook arrived. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood there, and the silver-haired man's hand came off Wendy's like it had been burned. "Mr. Reyes," Jungkook said, looking at the older man the way you look at something on the bottom of your shoe. "I didn't see your name on the list." "I have friends here," Reyes said, but his voice had changed. The smoothness was gone. "You had friends here," Jungkook said. Then he turned away from the man entirely, as if he had ceased to exist, and that, in the language of that room, was the deadliest thing he could have done. He looked at Wendy, and the most powerful man in 3 states, in front of 300 people who had just been laughing, lowered himself slowly down onto one knee in his $1,000 suit on the marble floor in front of a black woman in a soup-stained dress. The room made a sound, a collective intake of breath. He reached up and took her hand, both of his hands around it, like it was something holy. And then he said the name. Not Mrs. Price, not Wendy. He said the name she had given him on the worst night of his life, the name she'd whispered when his fever was high and he was sure he was dying, and he'd begged her to tell him something true to hold on to. He said, "Hello, Nightingale." And Wendy Price, 53 years old, who had buried that name with everything else, felt 22 years of fear crack open and fall away.
because in that single word was the whole truth of it, that the boy had lived, that he had remembered, that the soup and the stitches and the sentence about somebody who should have helped her and didn't had not vanished into the rain. They had grown into this man, on his knees, looking up at her like she had personally hung the stars. The room did not understand what they were seeing, but they understood that the woman they had laughed at was to the most feared man in the room something close to sacred. And one by one, the faces that had been laughing began to do a very different thing. They began to be afraid.
Here is what the room slowly learned that night, in pieces, in whispers. That the young man Wendy had saved had not been a criminal, not yet. He'd been a witness, too. Once a 19-year-old who'd seen something he shouldn't have in a world he'd been born into but never chosen. And the men hunting him that rainy night had been sent to make sure he never spoke. He should have died in that doorway. He didn't, because a tired nurse with no reason to stop, stopped, and the boy who lived made a decision in the years that followed. He decided that the world that produced men like the ones who hunted him would not get to keep producing them unchecked. So he rose inside it. He became powerful precisely so that no one with power could ever again do to a frightened kid what had almost been done to him. You can argue about the methods. People did, in low voices, for years. But there was one rule he never broke, one thing he was known for in every dark corner of 3 states. He protected the people the powerful preyed on. The witnesses, the ones who stopped to help, the ones who fed a stranger when they had nothing to spare. And at the very top of that list, written in his own hand, kept in a safe behind that photograph, was a single name: Nightingale. He had spent 22 years quietly making the world safer for her without her ever knowing. The men who would have hunted her, gone. The threats she never saw, removed. The little town where she sold muffins and slept soundly, a fortress she never knew she lived in. And tonight, finally, he had brought her here to tell her. But he had not counted on Reyes. He had not counted on an old enemy walking back into the room on the one night it mattered most. And as Jung Kook rose from his knee and turned, he understood that this night was no longer just a thank you. It had become the reckoning after all. Just not the one Wendy had feared.
Reyes was already moving for the doors. He didn't get far. The doors were closed now. Men Wendy hadn't noticed all evening, men who had blended into the walls like furniture, had become very visible, and Reyes stopped in the middle of the floor with nowhere to go. Jung Kook spoke without turning around. 22 years ago, you put a knife in a 19-year-old and left him to bleed out in the rain. He paused. He didn't bleed out. Do you want to know why? Reyes said nothing. Because a woman you would have stepped over, Jung Kook continued, the kind of woman this entire room was laughing at 90 seconds ago, decided his life was worth saving. He turned, finally. So before you reached for her arm tonight, you should have asked yourself one question. What kind of man builds an empire around protecting one person? The answer was in the room. The answer was the silence. The answer was the way 300 wealthy, laughing people now stood frozen, understanding that they had laughed at the one woman in the world it was most dangerous to laugh at. But Wendy stepped forward. Wait, she said. and the whole room turned, because the woman in the ruined dress was somehow now the only person with the power to stop what was about to happen, and she knew it, and she used it. She walked up to Reyes, this man who had terrorized her dreams for 2 decades, this man who 90 seconds ago had threatened her daughter. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something nobody expected. "I forgive you," she said. The room could not breathe. "Not because you deserve it," she went on, her voice steady and clear. "You don't, but because I spent 22 years carrying you around in my chest like a stone, and I'm tired. I'm putting you down tonight." She turned to Jungkook, and so is he.
Jungkook looked at her like she'd spoken in a language he'd forgotten he knew. "Nightingale," he said quietly, "you don't understand what this man is." "I understand exactly what he is," Wendy said. "I understand better than you. You only saw him for 1 night. I've been afraid of him for 22 years. She stepped closer to Jungkook, close enough that only he could hear. "And look what the fear made me. It made me run. It made me hide. It made me bury my own name." She shook her head. "I won't let it make you into the same kind of stone it almost made me." He stood very still. "You saved my life once," she said. "Let me save yours now. Not your body, your soul. There's still some of that boy from the doorway left in you. I can see him. Don't let this be the night he finally dies." There's an open loop here, a moment where everything hung in the balance, and I want you to sit in it the way that room had to sit in it. Because a man like Jungkook had only ever known one answer to people like Reyes. He had built everything on that answer. To choose differently, here, in front of everyone, would mean tearing up a rule he'd lived by for 2 decades. He looked at the photograph he always carried in his mind, the porch, the sun, the baby on her hip. He looked at the woman in front of him, and the most feared man in 3 states did something that no one in that room would ever forget. Something that got whispered about for years afterward, something that changed the kind of man people understood him to be. He let Reyes go. He turned to his men and said 2 words, "Walk him out." And Reyes, white-faced, was escorted through the doors and out of that life forever, alive, which was its own kind of sentence, because mercy from a man like that was a debt heavier than any grave. Then Jungkook turned back to Wendy. "You just cost me something," he said softly. "No," she said, taking his hand. "I just gave you something back."
The Gala did not recover. How could it? The string quartet never picked the song back up. The polished woman at the bar who had asked who let her in had gone very quiet and was now studying the floor with great interest. 300 people who walked in certain of exactly who mattered and who didn't were walking out having learned that they'd had it precisely backwards. The woman they laughed at was the most important person in the room. And the lesson sat heavy on every one of them, because each of them, at some point, had looked at someone in a cheap dress or worn shoes and decided that person was nothing. Each of them had laughed at a Wendy. How many times, the night seemed to ask them, have you been wrong about who matters? How many times have you mistaken a soft voice for a small one? A kind face for a weak one, a baker in a borrowed dress for someone beneath your notice? I want to ask you the same thing, because I think we all do it. I think we all walk into rooms and sort people in the first 3 seconds into worth knowing and not worth knowing. And I think most of us, if we're honest, would be ashamed of how often we've gotten it as wrong as that room got it. Wendy stood in the center of all those chastened faces. She did not gloat. That was the thing that undid them most in the end. She had every right to. She had been handed, in a single evening, total power over the people who had humiliated her. She used none of it. She simply gathered up the skirt of her ruined blue dress, took the arm Jungkook offered her, and walked toward the doors with her chin up, and her shaking finally stopped. But there was one more thing waiting for her outside those doors, one more piece of the night that hadn't yet revealed itself. Her daughter was standing on the marble steps. She had come in looking for her mother, and she had heard everything.
Her daughter stood there with her car keys in her hand and tears on her face. "Mama," she said. Her voice was very small. "Is it true? The nurse? The rainy night? The man you stitched up? All of it?" Wendy stopped on the steps. For 30 years, she had protected this child from the truth, from the past, from the woman she used to be. She had built a normal, quiet, cinnamon-smelling life precisely so her daughter would never have to know that her mother had once held a dying stranger's life in 2 hands and chosen to keep it. And now her daughter knew. "It's true," Wendy said. Her daughter looked at her like she was seeing her for the first time. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I wanted you to have a mother, not a legend, not a secret, just a mama who made you pancakes and worried about your grades." She reached out and touched her daughter's wet cheek. "I didn't want my past to become your inheritance. I wanted you to be free of it." Her daughter caught her mother's hand and held it against her face. "Mama," she whispered, "you're the bravest person I've ever known, and I didn't even know it until tonight." And there it was, the thing Wendy was most afraid of. The truth coming out turned out to be the very thing that finally let her daughter see her whole. Sometimes the thing we hide to protect the people we love is the very thing that would have let them love us most. Sit with that one for a second. Think of the thing you've never told the people closest to you, the version of yourself you've kept in a box in the attic, under the Christmas things, wrapped in a dish towel. What if it isn't the thing that would make them love you less? What if it's the thing that would finally make them understand you at all? It was a Tuesday, 3 days later, and the bakery on Grant Avenue opened at 4 in the morning the way it always did. Wendy was back behind the counter in her apron, dusted with flour, telling Mr. Holloway that no, she would not put extra raisins in her bran muffin. She had told him that for 9 years, and the answer was still no. The town did not know what had happened at the gala. The town would never know. Because Wendy Price did not want to be a legend in Junction City any more than she'd wanted to be one for her daughter. She wanted to be the woman who knew your order before you ordered it. She wanted the cinnamon and the 4 a.m. starts and the small, good, ordinary life she had built on top of everything she'd survived. But something was different now. The fear was gone. That stone she'd carried in her chest for 22 years, she really had put it down on that marble floor, and she had not picked it back up. She slept all the way through the night now. She had stopped flinching at heavy envelopes. And every so often, a long black car would park quietly across the street. A man would come in, order a coffee and a cinnamon roll, sit by the window and read his paper and watch the morning happen. He never made trouble. He never asked for anything. He just sat there in the warmth and the good smell, in the one place in the world where he had once been 19 and dying, and shown that a stranger could be kind. And Wendy would bring him his coffee and put her hand on his shoulder for just a moment.
and neither of them would say anything. Because some debts can't be paid. They can only be honored every morning with coffee and cinnamon and the quiet miracle of a life that almost didn't happen.
So let me ask you what that whole room had to ask itself. Who have you laughed at? Who have you written off in 3 seconds? Who have you decided was nothing because of a dress, a car, a job, a way of speaking, a shade of skin? And what would it do to you to learn, the way that room learned, that the person you dismissed was carrying a whole hidden world inside them? A history, a courage you'll never have to test in yourself, a name that the right person would cross a room on their knees to honor. Everyone is somebody's nightingale. Everyone walking past you in a cheap coat once stitched a stranger on a kitchen table, or could have, or would if the rainy night ever came. You just can't see it. None of us can. That's the whole point. The most important thing about a person is almost never the thing you can see. Wendy Price knew that. She knew it because she had once been the only person willing to stop in the rain, and that single choice, made by a tired woman with no reason to make it, rippled outward across 22 years and 3 states and ended with the most powerful man alive in a ballroom saying a name like a prayer. One kindness, cast into the dark with no expectation of return. That's the whole story, really. That's the whole secret. You never know which small mercy is the one that comes back to save your life. You never know which stranger in a doorway is the one who remembers. So you stop anyway. You feed them anyway. You stitch the wound and ladle the soup and say the true thing because somebody once should have done it for you and didn't. And maybe 22 years from now, on a night you've long forgotten, in a room full of people who think they know exactly who matters, somebody will stand up and cross the floor and say your name, and the whole room will go silent. So tell me, in the comments, I really want to know, when was the last time you stopped in the rain? And if you'd been in that ballroom, watching them laugh, before you knew who she was, before the man crossed the floor, be honest, would you have laughed too? Or would you have been the one person who didn't? Think about it. Sit with it. And the next time you're in a room sorting strangers into who matters and who doesn't, remember the woman in the soup-stained dress, and remember that you almost never know. If this story moved something in you, stay with me, because the next one is about a man everybody in his town called a fool for 40 years until the day they opened the will, and what was written inside changed how that whole town saw every single thing he'd ever done. But that is a story for another night. Subscribe and stay close, and I'll keep telling you the ones that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.